The smooth bitumen roads run out to whom? They run on till they fall into the wrinkled arms of the sand. The first roads were made by people from the cities, singing a new song in the vast emptiness. Now the roads run back into the cities, the roads and the rains, leaving the country emptier than it was before men came, leaving men's signatures in erosions. Driving along one of these roads through the night into a dawn of oyster shells and roses, I pulled off the road, made a fire and tea, and I met the wind again. It came up quietly, blew a little smoke into my eyes, and caressed my ears. It was wrinkled with sand and corrugated roofs, and smelled faintly of petrol and burnt oil. It said, I sigh in carburetors, hum along telephone lines, and scream through diesel locomotive horns. How long before the word gives me a man throat to which to sing a new song? Jump a little bit. Then this is how he describes the sort of village, farming world that he came from. We were farming Australian soil, virgin since creation, but for 3 generations, soil with its own song locked within it, waiting for us to listen and express it. But we were still English. England is our home. By the way, the Brabazons were Irish. There was an Irish nobleman back there in the 1600s or something like that. At the woolsheds dances, we danced English waltzes, Scottishes, polkas, and quadrilles to piano and fiddle. And at the 2 or 3 parties a year, the same items, after the same Coke things. Oh, do sing for us, Mrs. Steers. Do play, Gladys. You play beautifully. I've heard the Mavis singing, variations on Home Sweet Home. And outside, the night and the ancient hills, their only voices, the mohawk and the fox. Rain, rain, each drop a grain of wheat, and each cluster of drops a bunch of purple grapes. Rain. The long pole up the red hill, lit by a flickering hurricane lantern swinging from the axle. A train whistle in the darkness. A chain of light, each link a nest of laughter and conversation, watching it until it vanished into the night and the rain was colder. A mile further on, a light in a window, back from the road a little way, an invitation to turn in if one had an excuse. But loneliness was not an excuse. A shy boy in soaking oilskins could not add to the comfort of a comfortable farmer and his family before their log fire. Better to keep straight than stop for the moment with the half-open door and the stammered foolishness and the blush hotter than fire as the door closed again. Gives a vivid impression of that world, doesn't it? But Francis really came from as remote a place from the standpoint of the Avataric Advent as one can imagine. I mean, how far removed this was from Maharashtra, early 20th century. I'm going to read a little more of this. Jumping. This is the town of Glenhour, which was about 11 kilometers from his farm. The township was a sprawl of loneliness. 8 houses without flowers to cover their nakedness. A bakery. A store that sent you an account 6 months after you'd paid it, hoping you hadn't kept the receipt. A butcher's shop. The yarn went that Lumley, the butcher, went into the store and said, "Mr. Shalidone?" "Yes, Mr. Lumley." "Mrs. Shalidone, I reckon that Sam," her husband, "ought to get the Victoria Cross." "Why, Mr. Lumley?" "For putting up for all these years with a bitch like you, you know." So you get a sense of this little town's kind of maliciousness, smallness, stiflingness of that world he came out of. Well, so there's more about, there were still swagmen and the world of rural Australia at that time. When he was about 17 or 18, they sold the farm because they couldn't keep it up anymore. And Francis moved to Melbourne. Now, Melbourne at that time was really the artistic, cultural capital. It still is, really, of Australia, capital of Australia. And he actually had a very, very hard time making a living at all. He didn't have any kind of trade, and he went to some sort of a tradesman, and the guy said, "You're too old to learn a trade now." So even just to get enough food to eat was a problem. And then the Depression came along in the late 1920s, so he was there through that whole very rough period. So he scraped by. He gave a massage for businessmen, that kind of thing. And he became very interested in the arts despite his poverty. What he would do to get books is he would go into the local bookstore and actually steal books. And if the book wasn't useful to him, he would quietly bring it back in a brown paper bag. So if you wonder where he got his education and stay with God from, that's how it began. And he was very interested in music, too. He actually, over the course of time, was able to buy sort of an upright piano. He lived in this little room in Melbourne that they called the Dump, as a matter of fact. His friends would come by, and he took piano lessons and really got quite an education in music. His knowledge is quite impressive. And how he would begin to do that was Melbourne was the place in Australia where you would get, artistic companies or great artists would come through. Anna Pavlova, the great dancer in Diaghilev's company, came by there one time and made a deep impression on him. And there was another major, Brailovsky, I think his name is, classical pianist who played Beethoven's sonatas. So he would hang around the back performer's door at concert halls, and after the first intermission would walk in as though he was a performer. So that's how he got in, because he couldn't afford to pay for it, It's always made me wonder whether he maybe knows the second and third movements of compositions better than the first. And also there was a gallery school in Brisbane that he became affiliated with. And he became part of a group of young artists, Sydney Nolan, John Sinclair, Albert Tucker. I guess if you live in Australia, study Australian art of the period, these are really they were kind of the revolutionary breakthrough artists of that time. At that, in Europe, you had, Picasso and Matisse and people like that. So this group became attuned to what was happening in Europe. And they kind of precipitated a kind of revolution in the arts in the late 1930s or so. I think 1941, or right around then, there was a major artistic display, and some of Francis's paintings were in it. So he was intimately a part of one of the most influential artistic movements in Australia in the 20th century, I would say. They were his own intimate friends. And during that period, and he also was enough impressed by actually Beethoven and other classical musicians that he thought of trying to become a concert pianist, and his hands were too small, and he was thinking of having surgery to increase his... I don't know if any of you have ever played piano, but some of these buggers like Rachmaninoff have these huge hands. I'd like to murder them. I mean... he can't possibly play the damn piece. So he was very deeply interested in all of the arts, I would say. So when he writes about this in Stay with God, he was very profoundly immersed in it from that period. But he went through a kind of a dark night of the soul during that period. And what out of that, he found, actually, let me read a little bit of this that gives a vision of his discovery of art. Let's see.
What part of Stay with God have you been reading from in this autobiographical material?
I got that from the books about him by Ross Keating.
But I mean, what you were reading, or we were seeing about his, he would go up the hill and he'd meet these people. Is all of that in Stay with God?
This here, you mean?
Well, yeah, I think the earlier. The word.
The Wind of the Word, yeah.
I see.
It's really worth reading all of it. I think it's very beautiful. It's kind of an inner biography.
It's a separate book that I'm not really aware of.
It's out of print now, too. Yeah. It's kind of how he found his way to Baba, but an inner biography. Yeah.
You have an electronic version of this?
Yeah, I have this.
The whole book?
Lorraine Brown in Australia let me scan her book. So that's what you're looking at. So thanks to Lorraine.
Can we get a copy of it?
I'm happy to. I should check and see whether at Avatar's Abode they'd be content with that. I imagine. If they're not, they should reprint the damn thing. It's really quite moving. I've just read little bits of the emptiness and the search and the hobos and people jumping trains and that whole world that he grew out of. And then World War II, World War I and World War II. He was a little kid when World War I happened. And searching through all of that.
Did he also begin writing poetry as a child?
Yes, he said that when he was sitting on the plowing, he would compose verses as he walked behind the bullocks or horses plowing the fields. Yeah. So and his dad encouraged him. His dad was a literary guy too. His dad would write reviews of plays in Melbourne, so he got it from his family. Despite the kind of poverty, they were a cultured family. That was part of his whole background. So now here's how he writes about those early years in Melbourne. The city in which I found myself was not lit with the companionship of hope and adventure, but with candles that had got lost and were weeping great white tears which ran down the cheeks of the night. A city where the streets walked always to the same place where one was. This is Melbourne now, okay? I wandered for years, for lifetimes, asking everyone, where are you going? What is there when you get there? How do you make what there is yours to get to another? How do you arrive at the same beach at the same moment of a wave as another? Or on the same hilltop at the instant of a sunset? Then one night, a door opened. I went inside, and there was a piano making sounds like a fountain. He's describing his encounters with music now. In a moonlit night, like great hopes and terrible disasters, like a love that is buried in one's heart, which one does not know. And I went through other doors where dancers and poets and painters created new and beautiful dreams of ancient stone, told of the beginning of things. And books were as men were, noble and violent, full of wisdom and peace, and had songs to sing, and stood up and sang them. It was a city of people who talked, trying to say things to one another. Endless talk, until our voices became drifts of fog, out of which, now he's telling about how that artistic world vision was there, a sense of beauty there, opening, but it was also lost. Endless talk, until our voices became drifts of fog, out of which the eyes of our brains tried to stare, and failing, crept under the window into the street, keeping close to the buildings, pausing and looking back like an alley cat. Talked until sorrow descended upon us. Companions in mourning when the beer ran out. He'd have his friends all over to the dump, his place, and drink beer and fillet up. And young men, what they're like. We were having been that myself. We were looking for the word without first asking the wind to inform us. The wind has been with the word since the beginning of things and knows the word's whims. It cannot be denied. Here's a picture, the drawing of opening a door, and there was a piano and all the visionary things. I'm going to just jump to the end of this poem and read about his finding of Baba. Although it's told again in a poetic impressionistic way. Here is talking about a golden moon rose out of the Pacific and turned to silver, and the banana leaves cast moving shadows on the ground. And the wind for the last time spoke to me, plucking my ears infinitely tenderly. It said, and he's been talking about kind of the losses that happened in the world that he saw. Neither the horse nor the tractor, neither the buggy nor the motor car, neither the township nor the city, neither the piano and fiddle nor the sophisticated band, neither the oral yarn nor the written book matter. All that matters is the love with which one does what one does, and the love and the song in one's words. It has been this is the wind of the word talking to him, right? It has been a long time since we first met, a long time in your time, a moment in mine. For I am more ancient than the forests and rocks and the earth. It was I who sang in the stars on the first morning and shouted in the shout of the sons of God, a long time and a moment. You have endured the years, the thoughts that rose up before you like bullets of quail which dropped to the ground in a few yards, and thoughts that streamed out from you like the headlights of a car on a mountain road, lighting the road only as far as the next bend and the landscapes that will never be visited. Thoughts that crawled as maggots of praise, spat as cats of justification, and thoughts as open as the plains, as solid as the hills, as rhythmic as water. All these you have endured, and the loneliness. Go on enduring, for it is to endure that a man is born, to endure and endure until he is fit to endure the face of the word, before which the suns are but festive lights at a fair. Neither the horse nor the tractor. He had a section that I skipped talking about how horses all got replaced by tractors, and well, we had to feed ourselves, but horse whinnies when you approach, and a horse responds to its own name, and how the coarsening of the spirit was a result of all the driving out of the natural things of the world. There's been a section of the poem on that. But it has begun beyond this now. Men have created a monster which can devour them. The wind paused and then began to intone. And I'm going to jump a little bit. The wind laughed a great boisterous laugh, which set the banana leaves swaying and rustling like hula girls in the moonlight, and said, quietly again, all things in creation give themselves to me as my instruments, all things except men. But never fear, my young old friend, no matter what small god men set up and worship, eternal, beginningless being continues to be. That's a great line, isn't it? Endure, Remember that the only thing that matters is the love with which one says what one does, with which one does what one does, with which one says what one says. Endure. Endure till the word of creation breaks the seal of its long word, and I sing the new song to the word. Against that time, I ceaselessly seek throats that will give shape to my song. I am the voice of God walking in the evening, calling, Adam, where are you? Why are you hiding from me? Then it was only a matter of waiting for the advent of the Word. And he reached out across the separation that was between us and said, I am here where I am, where you have put me. And I asked, when, beloved, will I meet you? And he said, in my time, which is the right time. Then one night I had a dream, which I was swimming in the sea, and was carried out into deep water, where I sank. Down and down I went, until my feet rested on some solid object which moved to the shore. And I found myself sitting naked on the beach, weeping. Before me was the divine beloved himself, Meher Baba, smiling. So that's the end of the poem. And it gives a feeling of the inner search that he went through over all those years. And I had gotten to that whole period of his involvement with the whole artistic scene. He was drafted to go to World War II, but wound up getting out of it. I won't go into that phase. But in, I think, 41 or so, he got invited to a meeting of a Sufi group. And he wound up going to it, and there he met a man, the Baron von Frankenberg is his name, and this is the Baron. I don't know if any of you heard Michael LePage. He gives actually at Marana, he gave a presentation on the Baron, and he was a Sufi sheikh. He was from Germany originally, but he was had met Inayat Khan in Europe back in the early 20s, and was associated with that whole movement. Some of you may have heard of Rabia Martin, right? I'm sure, David, you would have, and many others of you, right? He was Inayat Khan made Rabia Martin the Murshida after Rabia Martin's death, she picked Ivy Deuce as the Murshida. Of course, this is before that had happened. But the Baron von Frankenberg was associated with her. She was in America at the time, in California, and was in contact and was operating as a Sufi sheikh. And Francis was immediately very drawn to him and really wanted to become his disciple. He must have been an impressive fellow to command the allegiance of someone like Francis, who was no pushover by any means. But the Baron actually kept him at a distance for a while. But after about a year or two, invited him to move up to his home in outside Sydney. And this is a picture of his house. It was outside the city at that time. And he hired him to kind of take care of the grounds and maintain the property. And Francis did that and lived with the Baron for a number of years. This is, of course, Inayat Khan, who came to the West in the early 20th century and was the one who brought Sufism to the West. Some other pictures of him. Quite a striking-looking fellow. And this is Rabia Martin. And, of course, Ivy Deuce as a young woman. And I think it was 1942, Rabia Martin went to a talk by Nerina Machiavelli, who was, of course, one of Baba's close Western disciples. I'm sure most of you must have heard of Narina. Elizabeth and Narina would travel around, and Narina would give these talks. And Rabia Martin was very impressed with what she heard. And in 1945 came to the conclusion that Meher Baba was indeed the spiritual authority of that time. He hadn't yet declared himself to be the avatar, but so that's a whole story in itself. She gave her group 2 weeks to decide whether they would follow her or not in rededicating her Sufi order to Meher Baba. So Don Stevens was there at the time and has told this story. Well, Francis, of course, was in Australia, living in Sydney, or outside Sydney, with the Baron's name given to him by an icon was Momin, which means the faithful one. And he was never altogether convinced about Meher Baba, although I gather that Francis indicated in the last years of his life he did kind of accept Baba. But nonetheless, never got in Francis's way. The discourses were sent by Rabia Martin to the Baron, and Francis read them, and immediately Francis accepted Baba, right off the bat. There was no question about it for him. Rabia Martin wanted to travel to India to meet Meher Baba, so she, instead, she wanted the Baron to come to California and they would travel to India together. And the Baron sent Francis in his place. And as you can see, the Baron was a man of means, a fairly wealthy guy. And so Francis went to California in 1946 and stayed in Fairfax. I don't even quite know where Fairfax is. Does anybody know?
I think it's in Marin County.
Marin County? Okay. So north of the city. There was a house there. Have you ever been to that house, David?
No, I haven't.
Some people have been to it. I don't know if it's still there or not. But it was going to be, I guess, dedicated to the Sufi order of the time. And Rabia Martin had Francis build a driveway, an access road to it, and Francis was the guy to do that. He was hard physical work, was something he could do.
But Ward, that house ended up burning down.
That's right.
And the insurance money was used to public trustees.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Okay. So Baba used it in his own way. I had heard that and I'd forgotten. Well, Francis lived there for about a year or so, year and a half. And during that time, Rabia Martin came down with cancer. And while he was there, she actually died. So her wish to go meet Baba in India was never fulfilled. And Francis wound up moving. Idus was then designated as her successor, and Francis went back to Australia and again took up with Momin, with the Baron, and he provided the funds with which, in 1949, with which they were able to buy. Here are just some pictures. This must be in America, because I don't think anywhere in Australia you'd find that much snow. Probably California. This actually, Michael supposed, I didn't get to show it to Michael LePage, but this might be Francis's older brother, who rode about 1,000 miles somewhere in Australia, the first person ever to do it. Quite an adventure. And this is a picture of Francis with Ozzie Hall. He was one of those who met Baba and was one of Baba's followers from 56, 58, part of the artistic scene. There are all these stories about all these characters. Peter Rowan could tell you a lot about Ozzie Hall. Here are pictures of Francis from that time. Bill LePage wasn't able to identify some of these like where this is. But this must be in the early 50s. Now this looks to me like Yosemite, probably. This is Francis with the Baron, as you can see. This is the property in Beacon Hill, which is where Mayer House is right now. I don't know, some of you know Ross and Jenny Keating, right? Jenny is the daughter of Bill LePage. And Marie and can't believe I'm forgetting, her husband, also live in the house there on Beacon Hill that Francis actually built for it. Here Francis is somewhere in California pursuing one of his Sufi practices. These are doubtless two California people, part of the Sufi movement, and this looks like Yosemite during his California visit. While he was in California, I think maybe Rabbi Martin urged him to do some folk dancing. So here you see him obeying orders faithfully. There. And while he was in California too, he really was very attracted, and I perhaps fell in love with this woman, Shireen. Don Stevens also knew her well. I think she was part of the whole Sufi circle at that time. And she was a pilot, I mean, not in sort of private sportsman piloting of airplanes, and she died in a plane crash in this period. And that was a big event for Francis, and I think for Dawn also. She was a very lovely, charismatic woman, apparently, and that made a deep impression on him. And you see in Francis's poetry, from this period into the 1950s, an emergence of the figure of a female beloved. Woman as the embodiment of beauty and loveliness. He later on fell in love with another Sufi woman named Sparky Lucas, who played that role for him also.
Something particularly all relevant kisses in eternity.
That's, which one is that from? I remember that.
7 Stars to Morning, but he writes out S-P-A-R-K, sending particularly all.
Oh, that's right. An anagram, of her name, Sparky. Yeah, that was a few years after this. But he moved back, back in Australia. You can see him doing the work of stonemasonry in the building of what became Mayor House. There's a video on YouTube. I just got a link to it that Michael LePage made of Francis's actually constructing this house with cranes and he hired some stonemasons to help teach him the trade. So this here he is again at the same property. Right now this is all city. It's like Sydney has grown out, and it's one of the most gorgeous views you can imagine. The ocean is everywhere from up there. And this is with his Sufi group up there. Yeah, here he is, lifting stones. Move this group again. And this is down on the ground floor, actually beneath the ground floor. He built this little kind of cave room there. And it turned out to be significant because when Baba came in 1956, Francis and his group put on a play for Baba called The Quest. Some of you may have seen it. It's in the book called The Singing Threshold. And Baba was very pleased with it and said he was so pleased he was going to give Francis a great gift, and the gift was a 40-day fast. I wonder, and Francis threw himself at Baba's feet in thanks and gratitude. I presume all of us would have done likewise. And so he actually did it in this space, and he had someone lock him in and just give him some water every day. So he spent 40 days in this little room that he built. There it is again, cabin. So you can actually go there at the Keating's house or Mayor House. These are various people. Okay, at the end of the New Life, Bob indicated he was going to be coming to America, and Francis took the opportunity. Oh yes, in 1950 the Baron died, von Frankenberg died, and he left his estate to Francis. It's kind of an amazing thing to do. Actually, the Baba world owes a lot to the Baron, because it was with that property that the Beacon Hill house was built, and then later that Francis bought the Avatar's Abode property from the estate that he gave him. And it was an amount of money that, I forgot how much it was, but it would be several million, maybe $4 or $5 million in today's money. So after a life of early poverty, Francis, became, I guess, kind of a rich man. It didn't change his way of life one bit.
Where did the money come from?
From the Baron.
Oh.
The Baron died and gave it to him. I don't know why his family went along with that program. I think his wife had already died. So Francis was in quite a different position. You wouldn't know it from the way he lived his life. But he became the Sheikh of Australia. He was the leader of the group at this point. And he went to America to meet with Baba, who was going to come to Myrtle Beach. And went to New York. Actually, he had the job as a janitor. Despite what he got from the Baron, he wasn't going to mooch off of that property. So he got a job in Fred Winterfeld's building. I don't know if any of you ever met Fred Winterfeld. Any of you ever met him? He was the manager of one of these big buildings in New York. And so Francis actually spent several months in New York and had an experience, got to go to the museums and the artistic scene and the poets and all of that. And there he met Sparky Lucas. Who this is. Her true name is not Sparky. She just died a couple years ago, I think. 4 or 5, something like that. And Francis wanted to marry her, actually. And she was a Sufi with Ivy Dews. And Francis, of course, met Ivy Dews. And they traveled down to Myrtle Beach and met Baba. And he met Baba in the Lagoon Cabin at the center in 1952. And Baba immediately sent him back to Australia. I think he might have had to leave that very day or the next day, right off the bat. And I think Francis brought up whether to marry Sparky or not. And Baba said, we'll see about that later. And it wound up coming to, Sparky didn't want to marry him. I think if you wanted a normal life, Francis was probably not your best pick. But I couldn't speak to her motives. But he wrote a lot of his poetry shows that, like what you were just talking. What is the word?
He spelled out her name as sending particularly all relevant kisses in eternity.
That's it. Okay. Yeah.
It's just, it's just a little stanza
at the very end, and the first letter spells out the name Sparky. So she was his muse for a period of time. And at that time, Baba confirmed Ivy as the Murshid in America and said that Francis would be the Murshid in Australia. So, and Francis seems to have... my impression about that is that he waited to see if Baba would bring it up again, and didn't feel that Baba wanted him to play that role and let it go. So the whole Sufi side of the story vanished with him. I think having found Baba, he felt that was the purpose of Sufism, in his case, was fulfilled. So that wasn't thereafter a part of the whole scene in Australia. And in 1954, Baba was doing tours in Hamirpur and Andhra Pradesh, and invited Francis to join him in Andhra Pradesh. And this was a period of tremendous darshan programs. It was Baba's last great period of giving mass darshans during his life. And Francis was there by Baba's invitation. And after that, he wrote a poem about it, Journey with God. Some of you may have seen that. It's a short poem, short booklet. Later, a few months later, Baba invited a group of Western men, 20 or so, to come to India in September in what's called the 3 Incredible Weeks. You may have seen that movie, narrated by Darwin Shaw, The 3 Incredible Weeks, culminating in Baba's, a gathering in which Baba gave out the message, the final declaration, which was a real shocker at the time. So Francis came to that. And in 1955, the next year, Baba invited Francis and Don Stevens, as I mentioned, to come to the Brabazon Sahavas, which is just for Indians. There are 4 language groups, Hindi, Telugu, Marathi, and Gujarati. They came by language, so that each group could, you wouldn't have to translate. And Francis and Don were there. And it was at that time that Baba gave Francis the order to write Stay with God. In so that's 1955. In 1956, Baba came to Australia for the first time. And Francis was his main host in Australia. Avatar's abode was not built yet, but Baba visited Sydney and Melbourne. He stayed in Mayor House in Sydney. And while he was there, at one point, Baba asked Francis, so what about my book? Have you finished it yet? And Francis had been very busy. I mean, you can well imagine, with preparations for Baba's coming, and he was about to come up with lots of excuses. But one thing that Francis always understood, and that was obedience. And he realized and bit his tongue and said, I'm sorry, Baba, I'll start on it the moment you've left. And Baba sort of looked off into the distance and said, that will be satisfactory. So after Baba left, he began working on Stay with God. And Baba came back in 1958. And a few months before coming, Baba sent a telegram indicating that he would like for them to prepare a center for him. And according, what's the fellow's name? Darn, he died a few years ago. He has a book about all of this. He said, in the telegram, Baba said, in Queensland, New South Wales, or Victoria. And because Queensland was first, this is the kind of obedience that Francis brought to it. Francis thought, well, I should try Queensland, which is a place where none of them had ever been. Queensland is like Hicksville, It's like as bad as, say, South Carolina in 1952 or something like that. Nobody who was anybody would ever live in Queensland. But Francis just got in his car and drove up, and there's a whole long story about this, but he wound up finding the property that became Avatar's abode and sent Baba a telegram, and Baba said, buy it. So it's 100 acres up on top of a hill. You've been there, Sam, right? It's sort of like a Marymount is overlooking it, sort of like Marymount. You've got your own, associated with your own version of it. Yeah. So, very quickly, the Australian group dedicated themselves to a frenzied preparation for Baba's coming, trying to get buildings ready in time. And they did. And Baba came in 1958, and that's one of the great Baba centers of the world, I would say, and it will be a great place of pilgrimage. And during that time, evidently, Baba indicated that he wanted Francis to come to India for a prolonged stay. And I noticed that after William Donkin joined Meher Baba in 1939, Francis was the only new Westerner to join Meher Baba as one of his resident mandali. I can't think of another. I mean, there were some who had already been there who stayed on, Rano Gailey, but he was the only new Westerner in 30 years, actually, to make it into the elite group of Baba's own resident mandali. And he was right there at Meher Gurupasad over that time. So he came to India right at the end of 58 or early 59. Here he is with in the 3 Incredible Weeks gathering, as you can see. These are just some general photos of Francis of that period of time. Yeah, more of okay, here he is in his later years. So he lived with Baba from 1959 until Baba passed away in 1969. And quite a few, some of the notable literary works of his from that period would include the East-West Gathering. Some of you may have read that. I think it's an exquisite literary masterpiece about that event, East-West Gathering, which he has most creatively interpreted into a poetic interpretation of it. And Baba also got Francis to start writing ghazals. So Francis is the English language pioneer of that literary genre. And the great collection of his ghazals is entitled In Dust I Sing. Some of you may know that. And after Francis's death, another collection, including many ghazals, is published entitled The Beloved Is All in All. By the way, next Saturday afternoon there's going to be a musical concert, and we'll perform a couple of his ghazals into new musical renderings of it. And he wrote quite a few other works during that period. In 1969, after Baba dropped the body, Francis returned to Avatar's abode, and immediately a whole wave of Westerners, of young people, of course they're Australian Westerners, started showing up, some of whom you may well know, like Roy and Roz Hayes, for example, or of course Michael and Jenny had known Baba since they were kids. Quite a few who are still there, actually, many of them living right around the abode. And Francis really dedicated himself a lot to cultivating this group of young people who became the core of the Avatar's Abode Center. The last couple, you can see him here as an old man, wrinkled, gnarled, I don't know, hobbit or a gnome or some kind of odd-looking creature.
How old was Francis when he passed?
He died in 1984, and he was born in 1907. So he was 70-something. He had lived a tough life. He lived a very hard life. So, and I think I have here, here are some of his. So this is, I would call him the poet of this Advent, the great poet, but had that role with Baba. So some of his major works would include Stay With, of course all of these are well worth reading, but Stay With God is a masterpiece, an epic masterpiece. Let Us the People Sing is a collection of songs. Baba had Francis write a lot of songs while he was staying there. Francis was constantly writing back to Australia, asking them to send him melodies that he could write songs to. The East-West Gathering, the Word at World's End was mostly written while he was living with Baba. In Dust I Sing is a collection of the ghazals he wrote while living with Baba. I was reading earlier a bunch of passages from The Wind of the Word, which is a very short work, poetic biography. This is a collection of his songs, the Golden Book of Praise, which has songs in musical notation. I don't know if it's for sale here or not. I don't know if it's in print anymore. And The Beloved Is All in All was published. He died in 1984, so it was published a couple of years after that has more of his ghazals and other various poems. So anyway, this is a little glimpse of the life of this very great disciple, Meher Baba, a great poet, and